Hi everyone. So what I want to do for today's recording is to provide students with some descriptions of ways that they can go about writing their paper. So this will be for your term project moving forward for the semester. So we'll talk about some tips and strategies, and we'll also talk about how to read empirical articles. This is one of my major goals for you for the semester, is to help you understand how to read the actual research that's being conducted in the field of criminology and in other fields as well, like psychology and sociology. We'll begin here by looking at some of the frequently asked questions about the paper. So there's an 8-page limit, but you're allowed to go over by 1 page or under by 1 page. And the title page and the reference pages do not count, and you do not need to write an abstract. You cannot just write on any offender that you've come across in your readings or in your studies. A list of cases has been provided on Canvas. You're also allowed to ask your TA for permission to write on somebody that's not listed. You need to actually go and get permission from your TA or from myself. And the reason is that we need to be able to understand the individual in great detail. And certain cases just don't have enough information on them for you to actually be able to apply your theories in detail. So that's why you need to run things by your TA. For the paper formatting, keep everything as standard. So you just use Times New Roman size 12 font, double space, just stick with the classics. Another common question students will ask is how many references they need. And there's no maximum references. You're encouraged to read as much as possible, and you can not just read but listen to podcasts, things like that. Anything that you want to use to gain access or insight into your offender is okay, but you'll need to use a minimum of 4 empirical sources. This means you need 2 empirical papers for each theory or perspective that you're using. Then you'll also need to look at some sources beyond these empirical papers, usually both for the offender and then also sometimes to get some background details on your theory or the perspective that you're using, and you're welcome to use the textbook for some of that background material. I'm also very happy to read a draft of your paper. You can come to office hours and then we can have a discussion of it, so you can share your screen, we can look through things. I know for some of you it'll be the very first paper that you've actually written as a university student, and it's totally fine to be unsure of what you're supposed to do or whether what you're doing is correct, so feel comfortable to reach out and ask. There's no problems with that whatsoever. Another question that students can have is how they know whether or not what they're using is an empirical source or a peer-reviewed source. We'll talk a little bit about that in more detail today, but basically if it's using actual data, it's going to be an empirical paper. And if you're really unsure about whether it's peer-reviewed or not, you can just send the paper to me or to your TA, and we can very quickly and easily tell you whether or not it's been peer-reviewed. It's one of these things that you just learn with time and with experience. So when you're about to write your paper, one of the things that I recommend is that the first rule of starting to write a paper is don't write the paper. Don't sit down and open up a Word document and begin to try and write a first sentence. It's not very useful in terms of your time, because you really need to do the research to figure out what it is you're going to say. To really have a good understanding of this, you need to start by reading. So I always recommend, whether it's to undergraduate students or grad students, the first thing that you should be doing is reading as much as possible, taking really detailed notes, and that will give you sort of a sense of, what do I know about this theory? What do I know about this offender? And what is going to be my sort of plan of attack for this paper? And it's really impossible to actually know when you're done reading. In this class, again, you need to have at least those 4 empirical papers before you're able to appropriately complete the assignment. One of the reasons why you need to do a lot of reading is because if you begin writing your paper based on what one study finds, what happens if you find several other studies that contradict the first one? So basically, you've kind of written something that is totally in contrast with other literature that's maybe more valid or more recent. So now you're going to have to rewrite your entire paper. So I'm going to talk about one way to write the paper, but what's really important to understand is that there's virtually hundreds of correct ways to write the paper. You don't have to follow my recommendations to get a good grade. One of the things that I actually really like about writing papers is you have an opportunity to do things sort of your way. In fact, I'd say that I don't really give you a lot of guidelines for this term paper, and one of the reasons is because I want you to be able to think through how you want to present this information, and so you don't have to follow sort of this cookie cutter criteria of how to write a paper. But here, like, are sort of struggling, or if you do want some feedback, you don't really want that freedom, this is sort of one way that you can write the paper. And I really recommend that in general, students have 5 parts to their paper, and not all parts are going to be of equal length. Part 1 is going to introduce the purpose or the goals of the paper, and this can be like 1 paragraph, probably not more than 1 paragraph. Basically, I want you to tell me why you are writing this paper, and the reason you're writing this paper can't just be, well, I told you to do so, or you thought that the offender looked interesting. Try to think about how your writing of this paper will contribute to the literature. How is it going to make us better understand the theoretical perspectives that you've selected? So here's a really important point. This is a class that emphasizes psychological theories, not a class that's emphasizing learning about specific types of offenders. What that means is don't lose sight of the fact that this is a paper that is testing your key theories. It's not about, per se, learning as much as you possibly can about an offender. It's great if you do so in the process, you learn about this information, but really the focus is on testing theories and trying to learn about these theories by applying them to a particular offender. So that's why I recommend in part 2, when you introduce your case, keep it relatively brief. Should be maybe a page, page and a half, but probably not any longer than that. And the reason why is because you're going to be going through details of the case when you apply the theory to the case in later sections. So not all details of your case are necessarily going to be important to writing this particular paper. For example, in a criminal law class, maybe you're really interested in the types of charges that were brought forward to an offender, or which offenses they were convicted of, how many offenses they were convicted of, what the sentence was, how the judge arrived at that decision, and so on. These are all important details, but not important to your paper, which again is about taking the theories and seeing whether they apply to your case. So try to focus on that introduction to your case, but why it's important to you to writing this paper. How does looking at this case help achieve the goals of the paper? So you'll want to focus, not so much on details like how many siblings this individual had or where they were born. Try to think about the details of the case that might be relevant to the theories you've selected. 3 is where you're going to introduce your theories. Both theory 1 and theory 2 are introduced in this section, and this will be your second longest section. And you can feel free to put in a lot of headings in your paper to help structure your paper. Heading 1 can be focused on theory number 1, and you're going to start by introducing sort of the key principles of the theory. So you don't jump right into empirical evidence, you don't jump into how the theory applies to your case. what you're going to do is talk about this theory that I've selected is social bond theory. It was developed by Travis Hershey in 1969. It's a form of control theory. Here's what a control theory means. Social bond theory includes attachment, belief, involvement, commitment. Define all four of those for your reader. And then once you've given the reader a sense of what these theoretical principles look like, that's when you can begin to dive into the empirical evidence for your theory. So now this is what's really important. This is the rationale for why I want you to read these empirical articles. I want you to get a sense of what does the existing research have to say about the validity of the theory that you've selected. So you'll be reviewing, and we'll talk about how to review these papers, but you'll be reviewing the evidence presented in empirical papers for the validity of the theory that you have selected. By reviewing the empirical evidence, you can get a sense of perhaps the gaps that your study is able to fill. Maybe social bond theory has primarily been tested on males that are involved in relatively minor forms of antisocial behavior, deviance, and minor forms of criminality. Yet your case study is a woman that was involved in, Eileen Wuornos, who was involved in a series of homicide offenses. So maybe the empirical literature cannot be generalized to the type of person that you want to understand. So the contribution of your paper is really to looking at how this how this theory can apply to a less typical type of offender. So you'll do that for both Theory 1 and Theory 2. And then the most important aspect of your paper is Part 4, where you're going to link your theory to your case. So for example, if you've selected social bond theory and Eileen Wuornos as your theory and who you'll apply the theory to, you would look at attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief in the background of Eileen Wuornos. It's not enough to just say things like Eileen Wuornos lacked attachment. You have to actually find examples in her life that would provide you with evidence that she lacked attachment. So you need to be very explicit about how attachment is or is not present in the background of your case. That's the other key point that I want to mention. It is totally okay to select a theory and then ultimately it doesn't work very well in the explanation of your case. It's not your job to show that the theory is helpful or useful in explaining your case study. Your job is only to show whether the theory is or is not helpful. So you don't have to prove a theory correct. And I don't really like using the term prove in the social sciences because we usually lack the research methods and analytic strategies to be able to make definitive conclusions like that. But basically, it's okay to show how somebody maybe did have attachment. So maybe if you're looking at Colonel Russell Williams and you found that he was married, that could be something that you would use as evidence that the individual or maybe that social bond theory was not necessarily especially helpful in understanding your case. So you'll want to apply all of or as many of the principles of the theory as you can to your particular case. Part 5 will conclude with limitations and implications of your paper. So you can talk about which of the two theories or perspectives that you selected best explained your case. Was social bond theory or psychopathy more effective in understanding the behavior of Eileen Wuornos? You can look at the limitations of your own analysis. So what information do you wish that you had that could have helped you better understand your case? What are the implications of your findings for research and for policy? So what types of treatment strategies or policy interventions should we have for this particular type of offending pattern based on the theoretical principles that seem to help understand this type of behavior? So the reason why we have an intro section is it helps give the reader a sense of what you're going to talk about. This is going to set the tone for what your paper is about, why it's important, and then the roadmap for the reader of what they're about to see. What are the sections that are going to be completed in this paper? I've talked about it a little bit, but I'll go through each section in a little bit more detail and just describe what we would want to see in an introduction section in the case description section, and so on. So for the introduction, basically you can say that it's important to get a better understanding of the applicability of theories to serious and violent cases. So to do this, you'll begin with a quick introduction of the case study, the key elements of the case study. Then the introduction section can state that you are going to look at the theoretical principles of the two theories that you're applying, review the empirical evidence of those theories, and then conclude with some strengths and limitations of each of the theoretical perspectives that you've selected. In the introduction section, you can then talk about how you'll take principles from each theory and use them to explain the offender's development and offense involvement. So that's the application of the theory section that you'll be working on later. You can talk about how you'll conclude with a description of strengths and limitations of the theories, and then provide a discussion for future research, policy, and so on. So that's your introduction section. Case study section is going to give your reader some context about the offender. Why should they care about this particular offender? Why is it important to understand their behavior? Information from your case does not need to come from academic sources, but it's up to you to think about whether the source is indeed reliable. Did you find just some random YouTube video where it's an uncited video, no sources, and it's just somebody in their basement talking about what they believe is, let's say, Edmund Kemper's mental disorder? So you need to think about who's writing it, can you trust them, and why. If you're relying on things like newspaper articles, books where they have little case studies in them, if you're looking at some podcasts, they can be reliable. Others I find are really bad and sensationalistic, and they also use it's not a writing style, but it's a style of describing the case that is really not meant for academic writing. You can learn a lot of bad habits by listening to case studies or listening to true crime podcasts and using the language that they use in your own term paper. So keep your description of the case relatively short, not more than 2 pages, but I really recommend just like 1 page, 1.5 pages. You're not going to receive a lot of marks for the description of your case. It's really, your TA is just going to look at whether it's present or not present in your paper, so you have to have it. But don't worry about discussing the details regarding your case, because that's going to show up in your theory application section. So you don't want to have in your introduction to your case a lot of material that you're then going to talk about in your theory application section as well. So you can maybe think a little bit like a reporter, just get the 5 W's down: who, what, when, where, why, and move on. Don't forget the purpose of the paper. It's not to write a biography on an offender. I'm not interested to see how much you know about a particular case. I'm interested to see how well you can use critical thinking skills to evaluate whether principles from 2 theories can be helpful or not helpful in making sense of the behavior of the case that you've selected. So in your theory subsection, I recommend discussing each theory separately. So you can have a subheading for theory 1, another subheading for theory 2. You need to focus solely on academic sources when describing theoretical principles. And then the presentation and summarization of the empirical evidence is the most important part of this theory section. You'll discuss the strengths and limitations of the theory. And what I recommend is you can talk about theory 1, and when you read the empirical articles for theory 1, the articles themselves are going to write in their paper like limitations of the theory. So you don't have to come up with these limitations on your own. They're going to be written right in the papers that you read for you. So you can specify that these are limitations of the theory, and then maybe you're going to select your second theory that can help address some of the limitations of your first theory. So maybe you're relying on social learning, and social learning theory is very useful for helping to understand an individual's social environment and how that might reinforce behavior, but it doesn't necessarily help us understand the origins of the behavior or the onset of the behavior. So maybe you'd be interested in using Moffat's developmental taxonomy or dual taxonomy to look at whether the adolescent limited or life course persistent offending trajectory best applies to your case. So that's a way for you to transition into theory 2, and then you just repeat the same steps as you did for theory 1. I'm going to talk about this towards the end of today's little mini discussion. But presenting empirical evidence can be done so in a very formulaic way. And I really recommend you follow this template. It's going to follow the order of the paper that you read. Sentence 1, when you're describing the empirical evidence, can be just describing the sample. Who was included in the study, where were they from, what was the size of the sample, and how were data collected. So these are the procedures for collecting data. Was it an interview, a survey, were people interviewed over the phone or in person, and so on. Then you can talk about which research question was being addressed on this sample. Sentence 3 is very, very important. When we're talking about the independent variable, we're talking about how the study measured its key theoretical construct. So if we were reading a paper on social bond theory, your independent variables would be attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. So you'll want to describe how the authors actually measured attachment. How do they measure commitment and involvement and belief? How we measure constructs is key to interpreting the validity of the theory. I measure attachment very poorly, and then I find that attachment was unrelated to a person's involvement in offending. Maybe the lack of relationship is not because social bond theory is not a valid theory. Maybe the lack of relationship is because I did a poor job of measuring the constructs associated with this theory. Look at how the measures of attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief were defined, and also look at the dependent variable. Are the authors trying to use attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief to predict general offending? Are they focusing specifically on violent offending, on sexual offending? What is the outcome variable? Sentence 4 can describe which independent variables, if any, were related to the dependent variable. And don't just say something like attachment was related to offending. The reason why you don't want to say this vague statement is because you haven't explained the direction of the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. What I mean by direction is you have to describe whether attachment increase the likelihood of offending or decrease the likelihood of offending. So instead of saying attachment was associated with offending, you would probably be saying that individuals with higher levels of attachment were associated with a lower likelihood of engaging in crime. Then in sentence 5, you can provide just a general conclusion about the study, the limitations, and future research may be suggested by that study. As I mentioned, the application of the theory to the case will be your largest section, and I don't really have specific guidelines for you because it's going to be very dependent on the theory that you've selected and the case that you've selected, but you want to be incredibly explicit about how the theory principles do or do not explain your case. Do not simply state that attachment involves a lack of connections to family and friends, and then state that Edmund Kemper lacked family and friends. Be very clear about how Kemper lacked family and friends. So phrases you can use are like, this theoretical principle explains this aspect of the case because Edmund Kemper was known to be relatively reclusive. He was spending most of his time moving around across the United States and never really had an opportunity to settle down. He lived in a rural area with his grandparents where he didn't really have an opportunity to make friends and so on. This is what I mean by being explicit. Don't rely on the reader to fill in the blanks based on, say, what you've said about Kemper in the past. Be very, very direct. For an example of a sentence to avoid, someone might say, Clifford Olson was manipulative, which is a core feature of psychopathy. What's missing from this sentence is an explanation of how you reached the conclusion that Olson was manipulative. What did you read about in biographies written about him or newspaper articles that provided evidence that Olson was manipulative? For example, you could write about how he told police that he would not reveal where he had buried certain bodies if they did not give his family members a large chunk of money. So you're giving this direct, explicit explanation of why manipulation is present in Olson and that manipulation is a feature of psychopathy. So for your conclusion, you're going to talk about what you found, which theory seemed to best explain the case, whether you found that there were limitations of one theory that were accounted for by your other theory, what you might argue for as an integration or a synthesis of the two theories. When you're describing limitations of your analysis of the case, you're describing limitations of your own work. So what information do you wish you had, or what do you think that you could have done better? What would have helped you to perform a better analysis of the case? Here are some general essay tips that I have. These are true not just for this class, but really for any academic writing. I definitely recommend using headings. Some might want to delete them, especially if you need to save space, but use headings to really help yourself structure what you're going to write. So only write information that is directly relevant to the heading that it falls under. Just because you use headings does not mean that you don't need to use transition sentences. Make sure you use transition sentences between paragraphs, even if it goes through a heading. Students should really try to avoid anthropomorphisms. I'm not going to take marks off of your papers, or your TAs aren't going to take marks off of your papers for using anthropomorphisms, but it's a writing habit that students should try to avoid. An anthropomorphism involves giving a human quality to a non-human entity. So as an example, an anthropomorphism would be if you were to write, "This paper will examine how psychopathy applies to Clifford Olson." This is an anthropomorphism because the paper cannot do anything. The paper cannot apply a theory. The paper cannot seek to understand. Only you are the one that is seeking to understand or apply this theoretical perspective. So it's okay to use terms like I in your paper. Although it's okay to use terms like I really recommend to you that you never use terms like we, you, us, or one. Students love to say things like, "as one can see, psychopathy applied to Edmund Kemper." Don't make inferences or assumptions that your reader definitely agrees with you. So avoid referring to the reader in your paper. You don't want to say things like, "as we can see," or "as we all know." One of the good ways of preparing for submitting your paper is proofreading your paper out loud. When you're sitting at your computer late at night and you're skimming through your paper looking for spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, and so on, eyes in your brain will try and just gloss over entire sentences. When you say things out loud, it's much easier to detect if there is a mistake in your sentence. It can also help you identify when you're using language incorrectly. I find that when we're writing, we can use language that we would never use if we were actually having a conversation with a person. If you would not say these terms to a person, or if you would not use this phrasing if you're talking to your mom or your dad or whomever, don't use them in your paper. One of the myths of writing papers is the idea that we have to use very colorful language, use jargon, use a thesaurus to say things in the most complicated way because we're now in university and we have to have a higher standard of writing. This is a completely backwards way of thinking. The goal for writing should always be to communicate your thoughts to as many people as possible. Make your writing as easily understood to the greatest amount of people. So you don't need to try and impress anybody by using words that could be really simplified. Also try to say things in fewer words. Really read through your paper to find ways to say things in simpler ways. When it comes to references, we'll have a little tutorial discussion as well on how to how to cite sources and so on. And I'll talk a little bit about that today as well. But one thing I will say for this class is that you do need to cite your sources all the time, but I recommend never using quotes. Always paraphrase things and then use an in-text citation. When you string together quotes, it's actually a form of patch writing. If you just take one quote and then add a but or an and then add another quote, this is also a form of patch writing, and it can be considered plagiarism, and it can result in getting a 0 on the term project. In some cases, it can even result in students failing the course. Another thing is to not use colloquialisms or cliches or social commentary. Don't say things like Clifford Olson's crimes shocked society. He murdered children. It's obvious that these crimes are horrific. You don't need to use colorful, flowery language. You don't need to refer to readers. You don't need to try and make the offenses sound exciting. This is why I tend to not like true crime documentaries, because those that are presenting the information are trying to sell entertainment. And it's not that I don't like true crime documentaries, it's just I don't like them for teaching us about how to talk about offending in academic writing. If you aren't sure if you're using a colloquialism or a cliche, just ask. Just reach out to me or your TA and send the passage in question and say, like, is this colloquial language? Don't say things like, since the dawn of time, people have been trying to understand crime. You don't need these broad colloquial generalizations. I've never taken marks off of a student's paper for providing too many in-text citations. Anytime you're referring to the work of others, you need to provide an in-text citation. If you have multiple passages or sentences to write about a given person's work, provide the in-text citation for each new idea that person presented. Try to be careful with your use of pronouns. So if you're talking about an author that was writing about a particular case and you use the term they, the reader might not be sure if you're referring to the author or the case that the author was writing about. So the next part of today's talk is going to focus on how we actually read and understand empirical articles. And the reason why I want to focus on empirical articles is because textbook chapters are tending to be too broad and provide just a general overview of information on the topic. We don't necessarily, they'll talk about a theory, but they won't tell you whether the theory is valid. How long have textbooks been talking about Freud's psychodynamic perspective, but not mentioning the fact that empirical articles tend to not support this perspective? Or they've been talking about the Stanford prison experiment, but not mentioning all of the studies that have been found that have shown that the study was conducted unethically, that Zimbardo lied about a lot of the research that he was doing, and so on. Empirical articles are valuable because they address a very specific topic and they're a little bit more narrow, but they give us a lot of more detailed information on the topic that we are interested in. And I think that for especially first and second year students, it can be kind of frustrating in these first year classes when you're reading textbooks, because you might find a topic that you absolutely love and the textbook will talk about it for like 2 paragraphs out of the 200 pages that the textbook is in length. Empirical articles are useful because they can give you some more detailed information about the topic that you're interested in. We need empirical articles for several reasons. One is to build ideas and develop theories from our findings. So especially for poorly understood or rarely examined phenomenon, this is a way to develop theories about these rare events. And this is typically associated with qualitative research. So the empirical articles are there for theory building. On the other hand, quantitative research is there to help validate or test theories. What if our theory, which we want to use to inform criminal justice system policy, is actually inaccurate? These empirical studies make sure that we are using evidence-based practices in day-to-day life in the justice system. When we're looking at articles in the social sciences that are empirical, basically all of them follow the same format, where there's a lit review that's talking about what is known and not known about the topic, identifying the gap in the literature that this paper is going to address. The method will talk about sample, procedures, measures, and analytic strategy. The results section is going to talk about what was found from the statistical analyses conducted by the authors. And then the discussion section makes sense of the results, puts them into context of other literature, and talks about the limitations of the paper and future research. When you are reading a paper, here are 6 questions that you'll want to answer. And below each question is where you can find that piece of information. So I won't read everything out to you, but just putting this up there for your own sort of reference if you want to use it as a guide or as a way to make notes, was a way to find the key information that you want from each paper. my goal is to show students how to basically apply a formula to their reading of an empirical article. And by using this formula, you can really begin to understand topics that you had no prior understanding of. The reason why I selected this article was I wanted to show students that I can take a topic that I really know nothing about, and I can begin to make sense of and understand the article. And there are thousands of topics that I know nothing about. So why did I select this one? Well, I selected this one specifically because one of the authors, whose name is Natalie Hirschlag, some of you might actually know her better as Natalie Portman, who wrote this article with her supervisor, I believe it was Jerome Kagan, when she was a graduate student at Harvard. So how do we find this article? Here is one of the things that I think will be very useful for you to know, not just in this class, but throughout your degree. Journals have moved towards making a lot of their articles more accessible. So what I'm about to say, you might not even need to do anymore because you can just very easily get all articles for free. But what I want to show you is how to get articles from Google Scholar for free. So the first thing that you're going to do is go into Google and type in the SFU off-campus bookmarklet, and then go to the very first tab that will give you instructions on how to set up the bookmarklet. Basically, find the internet browser that you use and follow the instructions for saving the bookmarklet to your favorites. So for Google Chrome, I literally just take this and drag it up here to my bookmarks bar. Then what you can do is type in the name of the article into Google Scholar. So go to scholar.google.ca and you can click on the article, and in this case, it's actually going to go straight to the article for free. So this is, I think, because the journal has moved to more open access of all articles during the pandemic. But what you might find is that some articles you'll come across will not allow you to download them for free. You'll get this lockbox that says that the article is locked and you can't download the PDF. Click on that SFU off-campus bookmarklet in your favorites bar and you'll be asked to sign in. So enter your username and password, click sign in, and now you'll see that the PDF is available. So you can click download PDF and there you go. Now you've got that article that you can download, save to your computer, anything like that. So now that we're all able to access the article, I'll go through and show you where you find all the information that you want to know. So recall those different questions that I had listed in one of the PowerPoint slides. We'll go and address each of them. So when it comes to the research question, you can often find this question specified directly in the abstract. So I've got screenshots of the article here, and you can see that in the abstract they talk about how methodological and ethical constraints have made it difficult to collect neuropsychological evidence from awake behaving infants. And so here in this study, they're going to use near-infrared spectroscopy to provide a non-invasive way of basically detecting hemoglobin levels within an individual. What they're saying is that they're looking at this non-invasive technique where it sounds invasive, but they're shining a laser into a kid's brain to detect hemoglobin levels. Whereas in the past, they would have to put on like this helmet, an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, to look at brain functioning. So you can find that information in the abstract. If you don't find the research question specified in the abstract, often it can be presented at the end of the paper's introduction section. So you can see this very clearly in the Natalie Portman paper where they say the present study sought to use NIRS or near infrared spectroscopy to monitor the activity of the frontal cortex as indexed by the hemodynamic response prior to and following the emergence of object permanence. The sample is basically the first subsection in the method section. In this case, like when they do experiments, sometimes they call it subjects, sometimes it might be called participants or data, but I like to refer to it as sample because I think that's the most common term used in the social sciences. So what you're looking for when we're describing the sample is how many and who. So here we have 12, so that's the answer of how many, and then who is healthy full-term infants. We can see 6 females, 6 males, observed initially at 5 months of age and then followed longitudinally for about 12 months. Sometimes procedures come before measures and vice versa. Usually procedures comes before measures. Procedures describes how the data were collected, and then measures describes what was actually measured, how the authors operationalized their key terms. So for procedures, you're looking for a description of how the study was conducted, how are people interviewed and assessed. So we've got here, they're talking about how they used an EEG basically to measure what was going on in the brain. And then what they were looking at for the infants was whether they showed object permanence. The object permanence test, if you don't really know about it, it's why peekaboo is like the best game for kids. Or not kids, but infants or toddlers. When something disappears from their eyesight, they believe that that object no longer exists. So because they cannot see it, it does not exist. So somebody is there, then they put a blanket in front of them, in front of the infant, and they disappear, and then they remove the blanket and they're brought back. And this is sort of just entertainment for the kid for seeing something disappear, so they don't think that it existed anymore, and now it's back, and it's crazy, it's amazing. So measures is basically describing how the researchers operationalized their key variables. So it's talking about how the NIRS system was used to investigate levels of hemoglobin in the brain. And basically they used 2 low power laser diodes to emit light, and this helped detect levels of hemoglobin. When it comes to the analytic strategy subsection and the results subsection of a paper, certainly feel free to attempt to read these sections and begin to understand them, but they're not necessary to read for this class. They'll be describing results in very technical terms, but in the discussion section, the job of the author is to describe the results in more user-friendly terms, ways that are more easily understood or digestible. So the discussion section, usually in the very first paragraph, it will say what the results of the study were, and will explain why the results were important. Also, towards the end of the discussion section, you'll find usually a specific subsection for limitations in future research. You'll typically find limitations written before future research because authors don't like to end their paper on a bad note saying, here are the limitations of my study, the end. Instead, it'll talk about limitations and talk about future research, which is very often ways to address the limitations of this prior work. You don't have to come up with your own limitations that you identified in an author's paper. You can just rely on their limitations section to identify what was wrong with their paper. But if you want, you can feel free to come up with your own limitations that you thought were present in the author's paper. There are fair and unfair critiques though. Unfair critique is author bias. Just because an author developed a theory doesn't mean that automatically makes them biased in their attempts to validate the theory. Be careful when saying that a paper had a small sample size, because this can be dependent on the type of research being conducted. Things that are more fair to critique are things like if you thought that the authors did not do a good job of operationalizing their key theoretical principles. If you think that the authors failed to include important subgroups, like often criminologists have a history of focusing solely on white males, this is going to limit generalizability. Maybe the authors interpreted their findings in a way that you disagree with, and you can also talk about that as a fair criticism. So how will you communicate what you've read into your term paper? You want to keep this relatively short. You don't want to be writing 2 pages on what a particular study found. Remember, you've got to write summaries for 4 empirical articles, so you want to be able to write all of this in about 1 paragraph for each of the 4 articles. You want to do basically 8 things in your paragraph. The first is to provide a citation. So in this case, we can write Baird et al. We're able to write Baird et al. Right off the hop because there's more. Now APA rules allow us to, whenever you have 3 authors or more, the first time you use that citation, you can go right to name the first author and then write et al. Then you're going to specify their research question. Baird et al. Examined whether near-infrared spectroscopy could be used to detect frontal cortex activity before and after object permanence. Then you're going to describe the sample in your study. When describing the sample, you can talk about both male and female persons were included. And then where you see that n equals 6, that indicates the sample size for the subgroups. So again, be nice and efficient with your writing. We can even describe the procedures and measures simultaneously. So 2 lasers were used to detect frontal cortex activity. Then the results. The authors concluded that frontal cortex activity was reliably detected using NIRS technology. And then we can specify limitations. One of the limitations was that only one region of the brain was examined. Another was that long-term follow-up data were unavailable. And then finally, for future research, we can again throw in a citation there. Baird et al. Recommended examining additional regions of the brain over a longer developmental period with repeated measures or more observations more frequently. So again, this is basically the future research is just addressing the limitations that were specified by the authors. So that's everything for now. We will talk in tutorial discussions. Your TAs will provide you with some guidelines about how to cite your sources, and we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into Google Scholar and how I think this is the best resource for students to use when researching their papers.
I think I'll go home and mull this over for a crown, it down my throat. At long last it's crashed, it's collapsed.